David is the enemy of Saul now, at least that's what Saul thinks, and so Saul is out to kill him. In chapter 19 of 1 Samuel, it says, and Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan loved David. He was delighted in David, and therefore we have a problem between Jonathan and Saul now going forward. Now, Jonathan tries to talk some sense into his father's head, seems to have some temporary success. In verse 6, why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? Verse 6 says, he listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. So now he says, okay, it makes sense. I'm not going to kill David. How long that lasted, we don't know, or whether or not he was simply being deceptive. We don't know, but he was right back at the games of trying to kill David very soon thereafter. And so he begins to send messengers. Well, first he tried to spear David again in verse 10 and missed him again. And then we come to verse 11 and 12. He sends messengers at David's house to bring him back and kill him. Michal, however, his wife, deceived these messengers, let him down, verse 12, out of a window, and he escaped. And then after that didn't work out, he sent other messengers. David had fled to Samuel, his protector, so Saul sends men after Samuel and David, and they are unable to do anything about it. So Saul comes to Samuel himself and David, and he came with them, and when he did that, God stopped that as well and caused him to prophesy. And so nothing that Saul's trying to do is succeeding. He simply is not being successful in killing David because the Lord has protected him. Now there are, in this chapter, three very unusual things that we should address that happen here. The first of all, we find that God sends an evil spirit on Saul. We saw that earlier. We see it here. Let me talk about that a little bit. God never tempts anyone to do evil. We have that clearly explained in the book of James. God does not want people to sin. But at the same time, God is sovereignly in control of all things, including evil spirits. And so God will use even evil spirits, demonic creatures, for his own purposes. And his purpose here to ultimately is to get rid of Saul and David to replace him. And so we see that happening, by the way, in the book of Job, when Satan is used as God's tool to accomplish God's purposes, even though Satan thought he was doing his own thing. So God does not tempt us with evil, but he can use even evil spirits, demonic creatures, for his purposes, and he does here. The second unusual thing is that when David is let down through the window out of his own house, Michal disguises an idol, a household idol, it says in verse 16, and puts a little quilt of goat's hair on his head so that the messengers thought David was actually in bed sick. So the issue is here, where did this household idol come from, and what is this all about? Well, we're absolutely certain David never worshipped any idols. He was always loyal and faithful to God. And so we know he wasn't worshiping idols. And I would doubt that those in his household were doing so. But in a household in that day, it wasn't just your mom and dad and kids. It would include all your servants and everybody underneath your realm. And David now was a pretty prominent guy. He was the son-in-law of the king. He was a military hero. He may have had a pretty substantial household. There might have been a few dozen people under his household reign. One of these people might have had an idol. They might have worshipped an idol. I don't know. Or this idol might have simply been used as a statue somewhere in the house for some reason. But we know David never worshipped an idol, and we trust that most of his people did not either. Now here's a third unusual thing, and that is that we find when Saul comes to David and Samuel that he begins to prophesy. And it says that verse 20, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they prophesied. And then later on, Saul also prophesied. What does this mean? Well, first of all, we don't know the content of the prophecies, but the Spirit of God would come upon prophets in such a way that they would prophesy something indicating that the Spirit of God was upon them. And so this was an indication that God's Spirit had overwhelmed Saul and was controlling him. Saul was no longer under control of his own volition. He was under the control of God. And the evidence was that he was prophesying here. It's a strange event, and we're not sure what this meant as far as content of the prophecy, but it does show that God's Spirit is on him in a way in which God controls him, and he's no longer in control of himself. He can no longer, at this point, seek the life of David at this particular occasion.